10 Misconceptions surrounding the real Dracula. Everyone has heard of the Vlad the Impaler, the infamous medieval ruler who was said to inspire Dracula. He tells countless tales of his passion for attachment, torture, drinking of blood, and judgment with an iron fist. Some of these stories are a historical fact worthy of controversy, and much of the real life of Vlad Tepes is surrounded by the dark shadows that we have illuminated with imagination. 10. Dracula did not really inspire. While everyone considers Vlad Tepes to be Dracula's inspiration, his son Bram Stoker, Irving, claimed that his father came to the idea in a dream. The evidence has been difficult for decades since most Stoker research notes were missing until they were exhibited at the Rosenbach Museum and Libraries in Philadelphia in 1972. Between Stoker's death in 1912 and the emergence of his observations, historians developed the idea that Stoker was present at a dinner with Henry Irving and professor who was to speak of Vlad Tepes. The relationships between Dracula and Vlad III appeared in 1958 in the work of the scholar Basil Cartelli. He referred to the biography of Abraham Van Helsing as evidence of the link, and the idea was repeated repeatedly before it was retracted by Stoker researchers who discovered his observations. Now that the notes have been examined, there is no evidence to suggest that Vlad III was related to the development of the most famous vampire in the world, but the myth still exists. 9. Use the name Vlad as an exhibitor. 2. The only inspiration given by Vlad Dracula to the opulent vampire Bram Stoker was his name, and even that might be an extension. It seems that the relationships between the vampires, the cut, the beheading, and the imprudent Vlad must be given, but nowhere in Stoker's memoirs there is any indication that he was aware of the character of the vampire Vlad. On his vacation in Whitby in 1890, Stoker found a copy of a book entitled An Account from the Departments of Wallachia and Moldavia. Buried in Stoker's remarks is a reference to a footnote in the book, simply saying, Dracula in Wallachian means devil. It is quite possible that the name was chosen for this meaning, not the contact with Vlad III, which was not mentioned in the notes. In fact, the original name Stoker chose Dracula was Vampire. 8. The meaning and use of Dracula is still debated. While Stoker wrote that Dracula means Satan, there is still controversy over what the name actually means. Dracula is generally said to refer to Vlad's father, pictured above, and to identify Vlad III as the son of Dracula. The Roman scientist and historian Aurel Rod has a different theory that begins with the idea that a tyrant leader is unlikely to be called a devil. But he says that the name is actually a misspelling in the Roman Slavic language. Dracula, which means Dracula, was probably a corruption of Dragu and came from a German-speaking Saxon who lived on the territory of Vlad II and fled I3. 7. The idea of drinking blood came from mistranslation. The cruelness of Vlad III was legendary, but the idea that he drank the blood of his enemies probably did not come more than a bad translation. In 1463, a poem entitled Van einem Utrecht der Historical van der Wallachei, Voivode Dracula of Wallachia, was created for the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III. When translated into the 20th century, the idea was that Vlad III had dipped in the blood of the men, women, and children he had been shocked. But even the translation by Radu Flerscu and Raymond McNally included the term essentially in relation to what the poem actually said. Another look at the mentioned verse shows that in fact, he says that he washed his hands with blood. While this is certainly still dark, it is also likely that it was not referenced literally but more than a metaphorical bloodbath. 6. Probably did not live in Transylvania. Tourism in Transylvania is linked to the fantasy vampires and the most famous ruler, but some historians believe it is doubtful at best that Vlad III actually lives there. Florent Corta, professor of archaeology and medieval history at the University of Florida, suggests that this is another case of Dracula's inspirational stories about the real Vlad Tepes. He certainly never lived in Bran Castle, the most famous Dracula residence. While it is possible that he was born in his father's house in Ciasawara, it is also possible that he was born in Targovist, the royal residence in Wallachia. 5. Vlad the popular hero. At the end of the 19th century, Vlad III was far from being a hated evil leader. Many literary pieces provided details of his heroic struggle for freedom from the Turks. The ruler of the Middle Ages became a national hero, praised for his military genius and his campaign for national pride. While not all literature is ideal, such as those focused more on the ways of Vlad on the final goals, whether Vlad is a tyrant or hero is still a hot debate. Nicolae Ceausescu was banned from the film Stoker's Dracula and was released in Romania after 11 months of his execution. Now, Romania benefits from tourism based on a completely fictional image of its most famous ruler, who had declared that he was the person who stood against the Turks. No one argues that 100,000 people died in the leadership of Vlad, so a factor in vampire legends with controversy over whether the end justifies the means, and the form of Vlad III is already very complex. 4. An alliance with Pope Pius II. After Vlad and his brothers spent time hostage to the Ottoman Empire, they had strong and understandable feelings about their captors. While Radu became a supporter of Dork, Vlad went in the opposite direction. When the Turks began to progress across Europe with their eyes on Italy, Pope Pius II began to employ his first line of defense. While many European leaders were not sure that the Turks were a threat, Vlad was more than happy to take the swords. With the support of the Church, Vlad stopped the practice of paying an annual tribute to the soldiers to the Turks and began to restrict them to bets to send a very clear message. In 6 years, nearly 20,000 Turks were put to death, while Pius II wrote about his military genius and patronage. Only after Vlad's death did the full account of the atrocities committed return to the Pope. By the time Pius II wrote his autobiography, his thoughts about Wallach's governor were quite different. 3. No one knows how to die. After retreating through the Carpathians, Vlad spent 13 years as a prisoner of Matthias Corvinus. He was released in 1475 and made a final attempt to regain his throne. He was, briefly, but died sometime near the end of 1476 under unknown circumstances. One story says he fell into battle when the Turks ambushed his troops. Others point out that his men killed him, either accidentally by mistake to leave or deliver a fatal blow on purpose. After all, his beast was legendary, and he had just regained his throne. Some stories suggest that he was assassinated by men who prefer not to return under his rule. 2. Or what happened to his body. There are more stories about what happened to Vlad's body. According to most sources, he was beheaded and his head was sent to Sultan Muhammad as evidence of his death. The rest of his body was reportedly taken to the Sanjeev Church. Stefan Wanderer suggests that he did not settle there at the end of the day, and then his body was moved to Constantinople and then to the Sveti Georgi Monastery, a monastery in Bulgaria, where the monks were supposed to somehow save his soul. Sanjeev was excavated, and the only ones that were found were mostly horses. There was no shortage of marginal theories about the last resting place of Vlad. A student from the University of Tallinn claimed that her discovery of a creature resembling a dragon in an Italian church meant burying him there, probably after his death was falsified, and paid to his daughter in Naples. Warning: spoiler, not 1. Some tales describe him as a just ruler. The rule of Vlad Tepes was full of horrific acts, but he issued a few policies that made some contemporary people paint him as a just ruler. Oral traditions tell the governor to keep order by handing over the sanctions with an iron fist, seizing land and wealth from allegiance, and rewarding loyalists. Stephen the Great in Moldovan wrote that Vlad's methods were harsh but necessary to protect the institution he ruled. Even as his war ended in poverty as the lower classes burned alive so that they no longer weighed on society, Vlad also clamped down on something that crippled the economy: imports. German Saxony merchants were heavily taxed and sold in certain cities, and those who did not He executed a large number of boys with ideas to redistribute wealth, and he would be named said, "My holy mission is to bring order. There must be security for all in my land."